Toyota's partnering with Make Noise today to highlight the work and journey of Dennis Lee of Namu Stonepot in San Francisco. Dennis, I was curious. I know you have two brothers and I have two brothers, and you guys grew up in a predominantly white community in Massachusetts. And I was just wondering what that was like, and what was your parents' strategy for kind of like engaging the American wilderness, the American experiment?
I never really thought about it that way, but I definitely think it was kind of that we just throw them in there, and the emphasis being the three of you need to stick together. That will kind of guarantee that you'll be successful.
No, it's so funny. My mom did something similar as a kid. She took one chopstick and she's like, one chopstick, I break you. Two chopsticks is harder, but I still break you. She says, but three chopsticks, if you three brothers stick together, unbreakable.
That's hilarious, yeah.
How did your journey begin, and how did you get to where you're at now?
You know, I had been working in the industry, and one of my friends came across a request for proposal from the city of San Francisco for the bid for the concessions in the park, which only comes up like once every 15 years or something like that. Wrote a proposal, pretended like we had all these things that we didn't have, kind of threw a Hail Mary, and then we ended up getting it, and that's really how it started. When I do anything, I think it's important to be honest with yourself, and to me that means having a real personal expression. And it just happens that I'm Korean, or my parents were Korean, and I'm Korean American, so that comes out in what I do. I'm proud of it, but I'm not boasting it, and I'm not hiding it either. That's why I think when you see our restaurant, sometimes it confuses people because it's not a Korean restaurant, you know? But also there are some things that are straight up American on our menu, and people will look at it and be like, oh, you got that Korean burger on your menu, or like, oh, cool, that's that Korean fried chicken, or what have you. And you know, it's a natural part of this cycle of like memes and culture, and it's changing so rapidly, not just the United States, but in the modern world. That's a large part of what we do, like just on a daily basis, is having personal relationships with people from other cultures. And what can be more personal than sharing food, right? Teaching our customers about certain ingredients. You know, we have this farm, and our farmer is this amazing Korean adoptee who has a totally different story from us, but in some way similar. Those kind of like personal interactions to me are a bigger focus than kind of like what's the sort of political landscape, you know? The way that you can eradicate racism or hate isn't by wagging your finger and telling people that it's bad. It's more like, hey, let me take you to this restaurant and try this food. And then they're like, oh my God, this food is so good. Let me tell you the story behind this food. Now that becomes a part of their culture, right? They might not be Korean, but now they have the sense of like, oh, I had this personal experience with this food, and I take that with me now wherever I go, right? So they'll tell their friends, oh my God, I went to this Korean restaurant. Have you ever been to a Korean restaurant? You know, like sort of shining a light on the darkness or educating people, I think is the best way to make noise or what have you, and kind of like go against things like hate and racism.
Even just beyond the food and culture, you're doing something with social impact here with Recipe for Change. And so I'm very curious, what did you cook for Recipe for Change and why?
Yeah, so for Recipe for Change, we decided to do a Stonepot rice dish, which is kind of like the centerpiece of our menu. When we chose to open this concept, we called it Stonepot straight up because when my aunt opened the first Japanese restaurant in the Boston area way back in the 60s, she wanted to open a Korean restaurant, but the bank people told her, no, you're gonna open a Japanese restaurant because no one knows what Korean is. And that's what she ended up doing, but you know, one of her best sellers was a Korean Stonepot rice because you know, they had Korean items going on like in that Japanese menu. And then my mom's other sisters also had Stonepot rice or bibimbap on their menu, and that was their #1 seller. And my mom's restaurant today, her best seller is the Stonepot rice. In kind of like that unsung hero way, we joke about that the Stonepot kind of has paid for all of our lives as a menu item. So that's what we're serving for Recipe for Change, and we thought that that was really fitting. I make noise by existing by sharing my story with people, by sharing my food, which isn't traditional Korean food, but it's definitely identifiable as Korean. All of that is making noise by making people wonder what it is, or by making people happy because they're familiar with it. It is this kind of personal experience when you experience, the hospitality in a restaurant, or even if it's to go. And we've been doing that for several years in San Francisco, and I think that's a great way to make noise.
For you personally, how do food and culture relate?
For me personally, food and culture are kind of one and the same, right? Like, food is a big part of culture. I think culture is just how we live our lives as humans, and besides like the nutritional aspect, food has so much more to do with keeping us alive, feeding our emotions, bringing us together, just so many different things. In all those interactions, I would say that's kind of like where culture lives.
Thanks for joining us today. We hope you learn more about the work Dennis Lee is doing to make noise in his community. And we hope you stand up and make noise in your community as well. Special shout out to Toyota as well for making it possible to bring these stories to life.